Alright, we're doing a quick demonstration of the Terulia dynamic map generator and how you go from an unformed map to something that looks like this. So for this demonstration we'll be using Fort Eldon Cave, the first basement layer. And as you probably know, the general form of an area is defined by paint tiles, and the way the paint tiles interact with either the paths or the other types of paint tiles within the area give you the final shape of the finished refined product. So what we're doing here is generating paths from the start point to the end point. I've also slowed things down substantially, so we should be able to see the path as it's being generated. So you see here is the actual primary path generator and the secondary path generator that it spawned, and also the tertiary ones that are spawning off of that. And depending on the different variables and parameters that you set, you can have paths that will take different forms. And path generation ends when the primary path generator finally reaches the end point. And this can be either very quickly or it can take a while depending on the different parameters you set. Alright, let's try another round. That cave looked a little bit boring. Let's see what happens here. Same parameters, second iteration. Now the secondary path generators are typically used to create dead ends and longer hallways, whereas the tertiary ones typically are used to broaden the main pathways generated by the secondaries. But this isn't always the case. So next we'll continue. At this point, refinement takes place. Refinement is designed to add character to the paths that have been generated in the previous step. And this is done by adding or removing small segments of path, especially to long flat areas that are otherwise featureless. Once that finishes, we move on to the fill. As you recall, the tiles around the outside edge are all paint tiles. So at this point, the paint will fill in any adjoining black areas and fill spaces like so. At this step also, there is an additional refinement to make sure that all of the filled areas correspond to whatever rules are set by the rendering parameters. So since mountains have to be at minimum 2 by 2, at this point tiles like this one, which if filled by mountain would be illegal, will be removed. After the first iteration there were 17 unrefined tiles. As you saw, the tile here was removed. After the next round, I'm guessing this will be fine because it looks like all the mountain tiles correspond to 2 by 2. What you're left with here in the middle are some unfilled black spaces, and these will be filled by the spacer tiles, which we'll go over in a little bit. So when spacers are added, these are added according to the percentage of total area that needs to be filled. Now the path has already been defined. We have a path from the start point to the end point, which was here, and the spacers cannot block an existing path. So spacers can branch off of existing spacers, they can branch off of walls, but they can't block a path that has already been drawn. So as you see, the wall here extended down, this wall extended a bit, and finally the black spaces here were filled in with the defined spacers. Finally, rendering takes place. An optional warp is placed here. It was placed in the top right corner at random, and then the map is complete. Let's see what all the individual parameters have to do with this. So to speed things up a little bit, let's take a look at what the individual parameters are. So we have the area base icon and the area base state. In this case it's border desert 2, which is here. So when we started there was no walkable space here, this was just empty. We had the paint tiles around the exterior defining the border. But here we define what the primary tile type is going to be that people are going to be walking on. Here we also have the area spacer 1 icon and state, area spacer 2 icon and state. And this corresponds to the final fill, which was here. So remember, these were the black tiles that were left at the end, and these were filled according to whether they were 2 by 2 blocks. These were the area spacer 2, and the remainder were filled with area spacer 1. And these are also defined according to whatever icon state you want to set them as. Now moving down to some of the other parameters. Branch rate, length, and linearity define first how often, as a percentage, new nodes will form off of existing nodes. So branch 1 specifically is how often secondary path generators will form off of the primaries. Specifically, branch 2 is how often tertiaries will form off the secondaries. And branch length is the total number of steps that can be taken before that node dies and it goes back to the primary. So when you have a secondary formed with a 5% probability per step, when one is formed it will take 40 steps and then disappear, and then the primary starts moving again. During that time, if during those 40 steps with a probability of 3%, a tertiary path generator can be formed, it will take 10 steps and then disappear, and then the secondary will start moving. Linearity defines the probability with which the current node will step away from its parent node. So with a linearity of 60, with a probability of 60%, each step that it takes will be away from the primary node. With a lower linearity of the tertiary path generator, these will tend to wander around more. So when a tertiary is spawned with a 25% probability, it will move away, but the other 75 can be any direction. So what this tends to do is you'll have very long secondary paths, and tertiary paths will tend to broaden wherever they happen to spawn. So let's change things around a little bit. Let's increase the branch 1 rate to 10%, but drop the length to 20, and decrease the linearity to 5. So with 95% probability, these will just wander around aimlessly. Branch 3 rate is going to be increased to 5. Branch 2 length is going to be increased to 15. And linearity will become, let's say, 75%. So these will be generally moving away from the secondaries. So let's start this up and see what happens. So here we have our first secondary wandering around. There's a secondary, there's a tertiary, secondary. So we have very frequent secondaries. And the secondaries are wandering around aimlessly. Although the tertiaries tend to be moving away from the secondaries. So we have a very broad path in this case, with fewer nodes along the path. Try one more time. Of course, every cycle will be different, and just because you set the parameters one way doesn't guarantee that the map is going to look like you want it to, but especially for very large maps, this tends to work pretty well. So let's set these back to what they were previously. Talk about some of the other features here. So next, let's go to no diagonal and link diagonals. As you probably noticed, when the path generators were moving around, they only moved in the cardinal directions, and that's because no diagonal was set to 1. If we set this to 0, then they can step diagonally and potentially create some very interesting paths. Let's see what happens here. So with no diagonal set to 0, we've turned off that feature. As you saw, the initial path was just a very quick diagonal line. but the rendering compensated for that anyway and filled in. With no diagonal set to 0, you're likely to get paths like so, where players would have to walk diagonally to get through areas that they can't otherwise see. Of course, the rendering can compensate for some of this, and you'll see what happens in just a moment when the path finishes. So in this case, there was only one diagonal here that a player wouldn't be able to see through if they got to it. But as you saw when the path was initially generated, it didn't look quite as broad as it does now. And this was a result of the refinement that followed. Now, a related variable here, link diagonals, is related to the spacers. So as you recall, the last step was filling in the remaining black space with spacers and filling in off of wall regions using whatever spacers you had defined up here using spacer 1 and 2. So that's where spacer 1 and 2% comes in. That is the total percentage of available space that is taken up by the spacers. You normally want to have spacer 1% larger than spacer 2%, and spacer 2% isn't required. But what this is going to do is, in this case, it'll take 13% of the total available space and fill it with 1x1 spacers, and it'll take up to 10% of the space and fill it with 2x2 spacers. And these are not mutually exclusive, so the 13% will just be 3% on top of what is already 2x2 if possible. So spacer expansion is the probability with which an existing spacer will seed the next spacer to be placed. So if this probability were 100, then for any new spacer that's placed, the next spacer will be branched off of that one unless there are no possible places where a spacer could be placed. So very high percentage will give you large features like this, and a lower percentage will give you more distributed 2x2s or 1x1s. So if you want things chained together, make your percentage, your spacer 1 or spacer 2 expansion high. If you want them distributed, then make it relatively low. Next is path intersect. During path generation, this determines the probability with which one path can cross another path. If this is set to 0, then paths will never cross, which means that creating a path can take an incredibly long time because the path generation doesn't end until that primary path generator reaches the finish. So if we were to set this down to say 5%, let's run it and see what happens. So in this case, we've got one path that can possibly lead to the finish. This one might, I guess, but if our primary were to end up, say, in here, it would get stuck here unless with a 5% probability we're able to bust through. As you can see, this path generation is taking substantially longer, but they're finished and now it's done. So in this case, we ended up with a very broad open map. See what happens when we set path intersect to 0. Path intersection refers specifically to things like running across from this path node to this path node. The primary can bust through, but the secondaries and tertiaries cannot. Set this back to what it was previously. Linearity here, this should probably be up here. This is the linearity of the primary path node. Now, an interesting feature here is warp back. If you want to have a whole lot of false starts and dead ends, then you would want to set this to some number that's not 0. I'll show you exactly what it does. So now with a probability of 10%, a primary path node is going to jump back in the wrong direction. As you can see, the primary path node jumped to the position of the secondary, which was farther away from the finish than it was initially. So the higher you set warp back, the more false starts you can get, which can be useful for making lots of dead ends. As you see here, that whole region got cleared out pretty nicely, although the final position of the warp ended up in a secluded corner up here. So that brings me to the last couple of things here. Permadark is no longer a turf variable. It is now a feature of the entire area, and that's so you don't have to keep track of the individual warps that lead to an area. You can just change it for the entire area all at one go. And finally, you can set a list of random warps, and once the area has been fleshed out, a single tile will be chosen from beyond some threshold from all the other warps, and that will be used as the position of the randomly placed warp. So in this case, we started out with our starting point here. The entire area was paths were generated, the area was rendered, and then after that, this tile way up here was chosen to be the location of the warp. And you can do this for multiple warps. Here, if I enable rendering for layers 2 and 3, we'll see what happens here. So first, so warp back to 10. So basement 1 is finished, then we move over to basement 2, which, as you recall, has 4 different paths. Each one will be resolved separately. As you can see, some of them have started moving, but they move independently. And some of these paths will intersect with one another, but all 4 of them will intersect with the end, which is here in the middle. And depending on how these intersections take place, we can end up with some very interesting looking features for a large map like this. As you can see, the secondaries and tertiaries are resolved first with higher priority than the primaries. So one of the primaries just reached the end here. Looks like another one's getting close. And that primary just warped back to this point here. A couple things of note. It's like another primary just reached the end. If you want to make a forest maze, probably the best way to do that is with spacers, specifically spacer 1, and a very high percentage. And that's just because they will not block off existing paths, but they will fill in to make them seem very crowded. As you can see here, the refining seems to be failing. In that case, the refinement failed, so the map rebooted, but you get the idea. Let me speed this up a little bit. So again, there was the first segment, and here's basement 2. Substantially quicker now. You can see the primaries as they're warping around. One of the primaries just finished. Here's one primary, there's 2 more. Alright, so this is basement 2. And for basement 2 we had 2 warps, and each of those warps was placed randomly, so they could have been just about anywhere. So here's one, and the second one's way over here. So this is how you can flesh out a large area in a completely random manner and get it to look somewhat decent with just a few path generators and some variables which you can tweak to your liking. And if you have any questions, let me know.